The doors of the council chamber opened before I even reached them, and that alone told me something was wrong. Doors on Caldranor Station never opened early. They were programmed to wait until the visitor's badge was fully scanned, until every protocol box was checked. Today they swung open the moment my boot touched the threshold, as if the station itself wanted me inside before I could think twice. My name is Ethan Marlowe, and 3 hours earlier I had been asleep in my quarters, dreaming about nothing important. Now I was walking down a corridor of black glass and cold light, flanked by 2 guards who would not look me in the eye, heading toward a meeting nobody had warned me about. Laura Finch caught up to me halfway down the hall, her datapad clutched against her chest like a shield. She was my aide, 26 years old, sharper than anyone gave her credit for, and right then her face had gone the color of old paper. "Ethan," she said, breathless, "they hit Haven's Reach." I stopped walking. The guards did not stop for me. "Hit it how?" "I don't have full numbers yet. Orbital strike. No warning. The colony had maybe 4,000 people." She swallowed. "They're saying it might be closer to 3,000 now." I did not ask who they were. I already knew. The Zarovex Compact had been circling our young colony for 2 years, arguing over mining rights on a moon nobody even lived on, filing complaint after complaint with the Council about human expansion into what they called contested space. We had answered every complaint. We had followed every rule written by people who were not us, for a table we had only been allowed to sit at for 6 years. And now Haven's Reach was gone. "Why is the Council calling us in?" I asked, though some part of me already understood. This should be an emergency session on the attack, not a summons for the human delegation. Laura's silence answered before her words did. "It's not that kind of session, Ethan. The Zarovex requested it. They're calling it a grievance hearing." I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. A grievance hearing meant the attackers were not on trial. We were. The chamber itself was a wide amphitheater of dark stone and floating light panels, built in a shape meant to make every species feel equally small beneath its high ceiling. Seats rose in tiers around a central floor, one section for each recognized member of the Council. Ambassadors and aides packed shoulder to shoulder in a room designed for calm diplomacy and nothing else. Today the air in that room did not feel calm at all. It felt like the moment before a held breath is finally let out. I walked to the human section, a modest cluster of seats near the lower tier, still marked with a temporary placard because 6 years had not been enough time for the Council to commission us a permanent one. Laura sat beside me. Across the floor, in a section carved from pale green stone, the Zarovex delegation was already seated, their ambassador standing at the front rail with his hands folded behind his back like a man who had already won something. His name was Threl Vok, and I had shaken his hand exactly once, at a trade reception 8 months earlier. He had smiled at me then too. It had not reached his eyes then either. The chief arbiter of the Council, a tall being named Senek, with silver-veined skin and a voice that carried without effort, rose from the high seat at the center of the chamber. The room quieted the moment they stood. "This session is called to address a grievance filed by the Zarovex Compact against the Terran Federation," Senek said. "Ambassador Vok, you may present your claim." Threl Vok stepped forward, and I watched 3,000 years of practiced diplomacy move through his shoulders as he turned to face the room. "Honored Council," he began, "for 2 years my people have endured provocation from the human colony known as Haven's Reach. Repeated incursions into contested mining territory, repeated refusals to withdraw despite formal complaints filed through this very chamber. Yesterday, after one final incursion too many, my government's border patrol responded with proportional force to defend Zarovex's sovereign claims. I sat very still. Proportional force. 3,000 civilians, dead in their beds, called proportional force. "We do not come here seeking further conflict," Vok continued. "We come seeking resolution, My government requests that the Terran Federation formally acknowledge its provocation, withdraw all remaining colonial claims in the contested region, and provide compensation for the resources my people have been denied these past 2 years." He paused, letting the silence stretch, and then added the words that made my hands close into fists beneath the table. "We also request a formal apology, to be entered into council record, for the human aggression that made this unfortunate incident necessary." For a long moment, nobody in that chamber moved. Then, one by one, I watched heads turn toward the human section, toward me. Senec's gaze settled on me last, and their expression, whatever alien shape it took, carried something I recognized instantly because I had seen it in 100 meetings before this one. Pity, mixed with impatience, mixed with the quiet hope that I would simply agree so everyone could go back to their schedules. "Representative Marlowe," Senec said, "the Terran Federation is invited to respond." I stood. My legs felt steady, even though nothing else in me did. Around the chamber, I could see the other delegations watching with the particular stillness of an audience that expects a show. The Velkari representative, whose species had joined the council 2 centuries before humanity, wore an expression of mild curiosity, as if watching an experiment whose outcome was already known. The Orsai delegate beside her was already reaching for a translation device, anticipating that whatever came next would need careful parsing for the historical record. Even Laura, beside me, had gone very still, her pen frozen above her datapad. I thought about Haven's Reach. I had never been there myself, but I had read the files. Families who had left Earth because Earth was crowded and they wanted room to build something of their own. A schoolteacher named Owen Price, who had sent weekly reports to the colonial office about how well the children were adjusting to a 16-hour day. A doctor named Grace Holloway, who had once treated me for a broken wrist during training, and who I later learned had transferred out to Haven's Reach, specifically because the colony needed a trauma surgeon more than any hospital on Earth did. I thought about all of them, and I opened my mouth, and I did not say what the room expected me to say. "Chief Arbiter," I said, "before I respond to Ambassador Vox's request, I want to make sure I understand it correctly. He is asking the Terran Federation to apologize for the deaths of our own citizens." Vox's composed expression flickered, just slightly. "I am asking the Terran Federation to acknowledge the provocation that led to a defensive action, Representative Marlowe. The loss of life is regrettable. It was also avoidable, had your colonists withdrawn as requested." "Regrettable," I repeated. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. 3,000 people. "Regrettable." "Representative Marlowe," Senec said, not unkindly, "the Council understands this is a painful moment for your delegation. But grievance hearings exist precisely to prevent matters like this from escalating further. We would ask that you consider the request in that spirit." I looked around the chamber again, at all those faces waiting to see whether humanity would fold the way every new species was expected to fold in front of an older, more established power. I thought about every meeting over the past 6 years where we had been told to wait, to be patient, to prove ourselves worthy of a seat we had already earned by simply surviving as far as we had. And I thought about the message that had been sitting in my private channel since before I even walked into this chamber. A message I had read exactly once in the hallway outside, sent by a fleet command frequency I was not supposed to have direct access to, but did, because some rules exist to be quietly broken by people who love their species more than they fear a reprimand. The message was 4 words long. It said, "Already moving, hold position." I looked at Threl Vok, standing there with his hands folded and his patient, practiced smile, waiting for humanity to do what every other young species before us had done in this chamber. Apologize. Concede. Pay whatever price the powerful demanded of the weak in exchange for being allowed to keep existing. "Ambassador Vok," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steady enough that it seemed to surprise even me. "I have a question for you before I give my answer." He inclined his head, magnanimous, certain of his victory. Ask. When your border patrol opened fire on Haven's Reach, I said, did they warn the colonists first? Did they give them any chance to evacuate, any window at all, even 5 minutes, for parents to grab their children and get to the shelters? The chamber went very quiet. Vok's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way ice shifts just before it cracks. The action was conducted according to standard defensive protocol, he said. That's not an answer, I said. That's a sentence built specifically to avoid one. Senek leaned forward slightly on the high seat. Representative Marlowe, the Council would remind you that this hearing is meant to address the grievance at hand, not to cross-examine the ambassador. With respect, Chief Arbiter, I said, I think the grievance at hand is exactly what I am addressing. I turned back to Vok. You are standing in front of this entire council asking us to apologize for our own deaths, and you cannot answer a simple question about whether any warning was given before 3,000 people were killed in their sleep. A murmur moved through the tiers above us, quiet but unmistakable, the sound of an audience noticing something it had not expected to notice. Vok's jaw tightened, just barely. The Terran colonists were repeatedly warned, over the course of 2 years, that continued expansion into contested territory would carry consequences. That is not the same thing, I said, and you know it is not the same thing, and everyone in this room knows it too. I let that sit in the air for a moment. Then I turned to face the full chamber, away from Vok, because what I needed to say next was not really for him. It was for everyone watching. I am not going to stand here and negotiate an apology for the murder of Terran citizens, I said. I am not going to stand here and discuss compensation or territorial withdrawal or any term of this so-called grievance, because grievance hearings exist between parties who are still negotiating in good faith. That ended the moment the first shot was fired on a sleeping colony. Senek's silver-veined face turned toward me with an expression I could not immediately place. Representative Marlowe, are you refusing to engage with this council's process? No, Chief Arbiter, I said. I am telling you that the Terran Federation does not require this council's permission to respond to the murder of its own people. We already have. For 1 full second, nobody in that chamber breathed. Vok's composure finally cracked, just at the edges, a thin fracture line running through his practiced calm. What do you mean, already responded? I glanced down, once, at the small comm device clipped inside my sleeve, the one that had gone quiet an hour ago after delivering its 4-word message, and I felt the faint vibration of a new alert arriving right on cue, exactly as I had been told it would. I looked back up at Threl Vok, and for the first time since walking into that chamber, I let myself smile, though there was nothing warm in it. I mean, I said, that while you were preparing your speech about proportional force and provocation, a Terran fleet was already 3 hours out from your homeworld's defense perimeter. I mean that this hearing, this entire performance you arranged, was never going to change anything, because we don't sit in rooms asking permission to answer for the murder of our own citizens. We simply answer. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, delegates turning to their aides turning to their translators, the entire orderly structure of the council session dissolving into stunned noise. Somewhere above us, I heard the Velkari representative say something sharp and fast in her own language, and for the first time all day, she did not look like someone watching an experiment whose outcome was already known. Senek rose fully from the high seat, silver veins pulsing bright along their arms, their voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. Order. I require order in this chamber. Slowly, reluctantly, the noise settled, though the tension underneath it did not. Threl Vok stood very still at the front rail, his hands no longer folded behind his back, but gripping the edge of the stone in front of him. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. You are telling this council, he said slowly, that the Terran Federation launched a military action against a sovereign compact world without so much as informing this body first. I am telling this council, I said, that the Terran Federation does not ask a room full of strangers how it should respond when its people are murdered in their beds. We do not require a committee's approval to defend ourselves. We already tried patience with you, Ambassador. We tried filings and complaints and 2 years of waiting politely while you circled our colony like it was already yours. Patience did not save Haven's Reach, so we chose something else. Vok straightened, some of his old confidence returning, though it now looked more like a mask hastily repaired than a genuine expression. Then you have committed an act of unprovoked aggression against a council member state, Representative Marlowe, and this council will treat it as exactly that. Will it, I said, treat it the same way it treated the unprovoked killing of 3,000 human colonists an hour before this session began? Or does that particular standard only apply in one direction? Senec's expression, whatever species-neutral shape it held, did not answer me, and in that silence I understood something important. The council had not yet decided what it believed. Which meant, for the first time since I had walked through those doors, the outcome of this hearing was not already written. Vok opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, glancing toward his own aides for guidance they clearly did not have ready to give him. Somewhere behind me, I heard Laura Finch let out a breath she had apparently been holding since the moment I stood up. Chief Arbiter, Vok said finally, forcing his voice back into something resembling calm, I would ask this council to consider the scale of what Representative Marlowe is describing. A fleet action, launched without council notification, against a member world based on unverified claims of a defensive strike. They are not unverified, I said quietly. You confirmed them yourself, 30 seconds ago, when you called it a defensive strike. Vok's jaw tightened again, harder this time. Senec raised a hand, and the chamber settled once more, though the air itself seemed to hum with a tension that had not existed 20 minutes earlier. This council will require a recess, Senec said, to review the claims made by both delegations before proceeding further. Representative Marlowe, Ambassador Vok, you will each provide full documentation of your respective actions within the hour. Of course, Chief Arbiter, I said. Vok said nothing at all. He simply stared at me across the wide stone floor, and for the first time since I had met him, 8 months ago, at a trade reception, with a smile that never reached his eyes, I saw something in his expression that had not been there before. He was afraid. As the chamber began to empty around us, delegates rising in clusters of hushed conversation, I felt Laura's hand close briefly around my arm. Ethan, she whispered, was that message real? Is there actually a fleet already at the Zaruvek's border? I did not answer her right away. Instead, I looked across the floor one more time, at Threl Vok standing alone now, his aides having already drifted away to send frantic messages home, and I thought about Haven's Reach, and Grace Holloway's trauma unit, and Owen Price's weekly reports about children adjusting to a new sun. It's real, I said quietly, and it's already there. Laura's grip on my arm tightened, just slightly. What happens now? I looked up at the high seat, where Senec was already conferring with 2 other senior council members in low, urgent tones, and I thought about the countdown that had been running in the back of my mind since before I ever walked through those doors. Now, I said, the whole galaxy finds out what happens when you kill 3,000 of our people and expect us to say sorry for it. The recess lasted 40 minutes, though it felt much longer. I spent it in a small side chamber with Laura, both of us watching a data feed that updated in short, clipped bursts, each one more strange to read aloud than the last. Fleet telemetry, system coordinates, a string of numbers that meant, in the plainest terms I could manage, that Admiral Grace Holloway's task force had crossed into Zaruvek space nearly 2 hours before Threl Vok ever opened his mouth in that chamber. They planned this before the hearing was even called, Laura said, reading over my shoulder, The fleet was moving before the Zaruveks filed their grievance. No, I said. The fleet was moving before the Zaruveks finished their attack. Command didn't wait for a formal declaration from anyone. Not from us, not from the council, not from a committee that would have spent a week debating jurisdiction while more colonies sat undefended. Laura was quiet for a moment. Is that going to be a problem, acting without council approval? I thought about it honestly before I answered, because she deserved an honest answer and not a performance. It might be. Politically, there will be delegations in that room who see this as proof that humanity is reckless, that we can't be trusted to follow galactic law. I paused. But I'd rather be called reckless by people who never had to bury their own colonists than sit quietly while somebody else decides how much of our grief is convenient for them to acknowledge. When the recess ended and the chamber filled again, the mood had changed in a way I could feel before I even sat down. The earlier hush of anticipation had become something sharper, more anxious. Delegates who had watched the first half of the hearing with detached curiosity now leaned forward in their seats, murmuring to their aides, glancing toward the human section with expressions I had never once seen directed at us before. It was not quite respect. It was closer to caution, the particular caution a person shows towards something they had underestimated and were only now beginning to measure correctly. Senek rose again, silver veins glowing faintly along their arms, and the chamber settled into silence with unusual speed. "This session will resume," Senek announced. "The Council has received preliminary confirmation of movement by a Terran fleet within Zaruvek's territorial space, consistent with the claims made by Representative Marlowe. We will now hear a status report before continuing with the grievance proceedings." A new voice entered the chamber then, relayed through the central projection column, calm and precise in a way that made the whole room go still. It was Admiral Grace Holloway, speaking from a command deck somewhere near the Zaruvek's border, her voice carrying none of the fear or urgency the moment seemed to demand. She sounded, if anything, almost bored, the way a person sounds when they are simply doing a job they have trained their whole life to do well. "Council members," she said, "this is Admiral Holloway, Terran Third Fleet. I am providing a status update per Representative Marlowe's request. At 0400 hours station time, following confirmation of the strike on the Haven's Reach colony, Third Fleet crossed into Zaruvek's territorial space with orders to neutralize the military assets responsible for the attack." Threll Vok's aides went very still in their seats. "I want to be clear about the scope of this action," Holloway continued. "Our orders were not to punish the Zaruvek's people. Our orders were to identify and disable the specific defense installations and vessels responsible for the strike on Haven's Reach, and to do so with minimal risk to Zaruvek's civilian infrastructure. We have completed that objective. 3 orbital defense platforms and the vessel identified as the origin of the strike have been disabled. No Zaruvek's civilian population centers were targeted. Casualties among Zaruvek's military personnel were kept to the minimum necessary to accomplish the mission." I watched the chamber absorb this piece by piece, and I could see the exact moment it landed differently than anyone had expected. Because the story the room had been prepared to hear, the story Threll Vok had walked in ready to tell, was one about a reckless young species lashing out without discipline or restraint. What Holloway described instead was something far more unsettling to every delegate in that room: precision, control, a response calculated to the smallest necessary degree and executed exactly as planned. "You will forgive me, Admiral," Senek said slowly, "if this council finds it difficult to believe that a fleet capable of neutralizing 3 orbital platforms and a capital vessel within hours of departure did so with restraint as its primary goal." "I don't need you to believe it, Chief Arbiter," Holloway said. "I need you to look at the data. Every strike is logged. Every target is documented. You will find that we hit exactly what we intended to hit, nothing more." The Orsai delegate, near the upper tier, raised a hand, requesting to speak, and Senek granted it with a nod. "Admiral Holloway," the Orsai delegate said, their translator rendering the words in a careful, measured tone. If your intention was restraint, why act at all, before this council had the opportunity to investigate and mediate? There was a pause before Holloway answered, and when she did, her voice had lost its dry humor entirely. Because mediation takes time, she said, and every hour we spend debating jurisdiction is an hour another colony spends undefended. Haven's Reach did not have the luxury of a council session before it was attacked. I was not willing to give that same luxury to the next target, if there was going to be one. A long silence followed. I watched several delegates exchange glances, quiet conversations passing between neighboring seats in half a dozen languages I did not understand but could read well enough by the tone alone. Something in the room was shifting, and it was not shifting in Threl Vok's favor. Vok, to his credit, did not simply stand there and let the silence work against him. He stepped forward again, drawing himself up with the same practiced composure he had worn at the start of the session, though I could see now how much effort it cost him to hold it in place. "Chief Arbiter," he said, "even if the Terran fleet's actions were as precise as Admiral Holloway claims, this does not change the fundamental fact before this council. A member state's territory was invaded and its military assets destroyed, without authorization, by a species that has held council membership for less than a decade. If this is allowed to stand without consequence, what precedent does it set? Any species with sufficient military strength could simply bypass this council's authority whenever it judged itself wronged. It was, I had to admit, the strongest point he had made all day, and I could see it land with several delegates who had until that moment seemed sympathetic to our position. The Velkari representative in particular leaned forward with an expression of genuine concern, and I understood immediately that this was the argument I needed to answer, carefully, before it took root. I stood, and this time I did not wait for Senec to invite me to speak. "Chief Arbiter, if I may." Senec gestured for me to continue. "Ambassador Vok raises a fair question," I said, "and I want to answer it honestly rather than dismiss it. He is right that if any species could simply ignore this council whenever convenient, the entire structure of galactic law would mean nothing. I understand why that concerns this room." I paused, letting that acknowledgement settle before continuing. "But there is a difference between ignoring this council's authority and refusing to wait for it while our people are actively being murdered. The Terran Federation did not bypass this council out of contempt for its process. We bypassed a decision-making body that, by its own design, requires days or weeks to authorize any collective response, because our colonists did not have days or weeks. They had hours, and in the end, they did not even have that." I turned slightly, addressing the wider chamber now rather than Vok alone. "I will put it plainly," I said. "If this council wishes to establish a rule that binds every member state to wait for collective authorization before defending its own people from an active, ongoing threat, then I would ask this council to consider what that rule would have meant for Haven's Reach. It would have meant that even if we had somehow known the attack was coming, we would have been required to file for authorization first, and wait, while the countdown to that colony's destruction continued regardless. I do not believe any species in this chamber, if placed in our position, would have made a different choice than we did." I let my gaze move slowly across the tiers, resting for a moment on each delegation in turn, the Velkari, the Orsai, half a dozen others whose names I had learned over 6 long years of careful, patient diplomacy. "We did not attack a defenseless world," I continued. "We responded to a colony full of murdered civilians by disabling the specific military assets responsible, with documented restraint, in a fraction of the time this council would have required simply to schedule a vote. If that is a precedent this council fears, I would gently suggest the fear is misplaced. The precedent we are setting is not that any species can act however it wishes. The precedent is that a species which is attacked without warning is entitled to respond without waiting for permission from people who were not the ones bleeding." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then, from somewhere in the upper tiers, I heard a single voice, low and clear, belonging to a delegate I did not immediately recognize. She is not wrong. It was the Valkyrie representative, and she had said it quietly, almost to herself, but in a chamber built for acoustics, the words carried further than she perhaps intended. Several heads turned toward her, and rather than retreat from the statement, she straightened in her seat and repeated it, louder this time, clearly enough that the translation systems caught every word. "Representative Marlowe is not wrong," she said. "My own government would not have waited either, had our colonies been the ones attacked. We simply have never been asked to say so plainly, in this room, before now." Threl Vok's composure, already thin, finally began to fracture in earnest. "Honored delegate, with respect, this is precisely the kind of reasoning that leads to unchecked military escalation across the entire Compact Council relationship. If every species is permitted to act unilaterally whenever it feels sufficiently provoked, nobody attacked your homeworld while you slept, Ambassador," the Valkyrie representative said, cutting him off with an evenness that somehow felt sharper than anger would have. 3,000 humans did not have that privilege. Vok fell silent. Around him, I watched his own aides shift uncomfortably in their seats, no longer meeting his eyes. Senek raised a hand once more, restoring order, though the balance of the room had visibly tilted since the recess began. "The Council notes the arguments presented by both parties," Senek said. "We will now turn to the matter that prompted this hearing in the first place. Ambassador Vok, this Council would like to understand, in detail, the sequence of events that led to the strike on Haven's Reach." Vok hesitated, and in that hesitation, brief as it was, I saw something I had been waiting for since the moment I walked into that chamber. Not fear exactly, something closer to the recognition that the story he had arrived to tell was no longer the only story this room was interested in hearing. "Chief Arbiter," he said carefully, "as I stated earlier, the strike was conducted in response to repeated territorial incursions by Terran colonists into contested mining space." "You have stated the justification," Senek said. "I am asking for the sequence. When was the decision to strike made? Who authorized it? What warning, if any, was issued beforehand?" I felt Laura's hand find my arm again, gripping it tightly, and I understood why. This was the question I had asked him at the very start of the hearing, the one he had answered with a sentence built to avoid answering it. Now the chief arbiter of the entire council was asking it directly, in front of every delegation present, and there would be no dodging it a second time. Vok's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely uncertain of what to say. "The decision," he began slowly, "was made by my government's Border Defense Command, following an assessment that continued incursions posed an unacceptable risk to Zaruvek's sovereign resources." "That is not an answer to my question either, Ambassador," Senek said, and there was something new in the chief arbiter's voice now, a coolness that had not been there at the start of the session. "I asked whether any warning was issued to the colony before the strike was carried out." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the chamber's environmental systems beneath it. Somewhere above us, the Orsai delegate had stopped adjusting their translation device entirely, waiting, along with everyone else, for an answer that seemed to grow heavier the longer it was withheld. Finally, Threl Vok spoke, and his voice, for the first time all day, had lost every trace of its earlier polish. "No warning was issued," he said quietly. "The strike was intended to be decisive. The chamber did not erupt this time. It went colder and quieter, in a way that felt far more dangerous than noise ever could have. I watched delegate after delegate turn away from Vok, not in anger exactly, but in something closer to the particular disappointment reserved for someone who has just confirmed, in their own words, the very thing they had spent the entire session trying to avoid admitting. Senek looked down at Vok for a long moment before speaking again, and when they did, their voice carried the full weight of the high seat behind it. "This council will take a recess of 1 full day," Senek said, to review all evidence submitted by both delegations, including the sequence of events now confirmed by Ambassador Vok himself. When we reconvene, this council will determine formal findings regarding responsibility for the events at Haven's Reach, and regarding the conduct of the Terran response that followed. Vok opened his mouth as if to object, then seemed to think better of it, and simply inclined his head instead, the gesture of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time that day, exactly how much ground he had lost. As the chamber began to empty, I remained in my seat a moment longer than necessary, watching Threl Vok gather his aides and retreat toward the exit reserved for the Zaruvex delegation. He did not look back at me. I found that I did not need him to. Laura leaned close, her voice low enough that only I could hear it. He just admitted it, in front of the entire council. He did, I said. Do you think he knew that's what would happen? That admitting it would cost him everything? I watched the last of the Zaruvex delegation disappear through the far doors, and I thought about Haven's Reach, and Grace Holloway's calm, precise voice, describing exactly what her fleet had and had not destroyed, and Owen Price's weekly reports that would never be written again. I think, I said, he believed this council would let him get away with it, the same way it has let others get away with far less honest justifications before us. I think today was the first time anyone in that room had ever bothered to ask him a question he could not find a way around. Laura was quiet for a moment. And now? Now, I said, standing, we find out whether this council is willing to write down, in its own record, exactly what kind of species we are dealing with. Both of them. The one-day recess turned into something closer to a full rotation of the station's artificial clock, and I spent most of it in the small human delegation office 2 levels below the main chamber, reading through reports that arrived faster than I could properly absorb them. Laura had not slept, though she would not admit it, and by the time the summons came for the reconvened session, both of us were running on caffeine substitute and the particular kind of nervous energy that comes from waiting for a verdict you cannot influence anymore. The chamber, when we entered it again, felt different in a way I could not immediately name. It took me a moment to realize why. Every previous session I had attended in that room carried an undertone of performance, delegates arranging themselves for effect, aides passing notes, meant to be seen being passed. Today there was none of that. The tiers were full, fuller than I had ever seen them. Delegations from species who rarely bothered attending routine hearings now present and watching in absolute silence. Word had clearly spread. Threl Vok was already seated when we arrived, his usual place at the front rail of the Zaruvex section, conspicuously empty. He had chosen, this time, to sit among his own delegation rather than stand apart from them, and I understood the choice immediately. Standing alone at that rail had made him the face of his government's justification. Sitting among his aides now made him simply one voice among several, a small attempt to share the weight of what was coming. Senek rose at the center of the chamber, and the silence that followed felt different from the silence at the start of the previous session. That silence had been anticipation. This was something closer to held breath. This council has reviewed the evidence submitted by both the Terran Federation and the Zaruvex Compact, Senek began, including fleet telemetry, colonial defense logs, diplomatic correspondence spanning the past 2 years, and the direct testimony given in this chamber by Ambassador Vok regarding the absence of any warning prior to the strike on Haven's Reach. I felt Laura's hand find mine beneath the table, and I let her hold it, because my own hands were not entirely steady either. Before this council delivers its findings, Senek continued, we will hear final statements from both delegations. Ambassador Vok, you may speak first. Vok rose slowly, and when he reached the front rail, he did not stand with the same easy confidence he had worn the day before. He stood the way a person stands when they know the outcome is already decided, and the only thing left to determine is how much dignity they can carry out of the room with them. Honored Council, he said, I will not attempt, in this final statement, to undo what was confirmed yesterday. I gave this council an honest answer to a direct question, and I stand by the honesty of that answer, even as I recognize what it has cost my delegation's position." He paused, and for the first time since I had met him, his voice carried something that sounded almost like genuine regret, though I could not tell if it was regret for the strike itself or regret for how badly the hearing had gone. "I would ask only that this council consider the full context of 2 years of unresolved territorial dispute and recognize that the failure here was not solely one of restraint in a single moment, but of a diplomatic process that allowed tension to build for far too long without resolution." It was, I thought, the closest thing to an honest statement I had heard from him since the hearing began, and I found myself almost respecting it, even as I could not forgive what it was attempting to soften. Senek turned to me next. "Representative Marlowe, the Terran Federation may offer its final statement." I rose, and I did not walk to any rail or podium. I simply stood where I was, in the modest human section with its temporary placard, because I had decided, sometime during the long recess, that I did not need to perform confidence I already had. "Chief Arbiter," I said, "I don't have much to add to what has already been said in this chamber. Ambassador Vok has confirmed, in his own words, that his government struck a civilian colony without warning. My government responded by disabling the specific military assets responsible, with documented restraint, and reported that response to this council with full transparency the moment we were given the opportunity to do so." I paused, letting the simplicity of that summary sit in the room for a moment before continuing. "I will say one more thing, though, because I think it matters beyond the specific findings this council is about to deliver. 6 years ago, when the Terran Federation was granted membership in this council, we were told, gently but clearly, that we would need to prove ourselves. That trust in this chamber is earned slowly, through patience and cooperation, and that a young species should expect to be tested more carefully than an established one." I looked around the tiers, meeting as many eyes as I could in the time I had. I understand why that expectation existed. I even understood, at the time, why it seemed fair. But I want this council to understand something in return. We are not interested in earning trust by accepting the deaths of our own people quietly. We are not interested in proving our maturity by apologizing for our own murders. If that is what this chamber requires of new members, then this chamber will need to find a different way to measure us, because we will not provide that particular proof. I sat down. The chamber remained silent for a long moment, and then Senek rose fully, silver veins glowing steady and bright along their arms, and the room settled into the particular stillness that comes only in the seconds before something irreversible is spoken aloud. "This council has reached its findings," Senek said, "regarding the strike on the colony of Haven's Reach. This council finds the Zaravex Compact in direct violation of council statute governing the treatment of civilian populations during territorial disputes. The absence of any warning prior to an act of lethal force against a non-combatant colony constitutes, by this council's own long-standing definition, an act of premeditated aggression rather than a defensive action." A murmur ran through the tiers, quickly silenced as Senek continued. "Regarding the Terran Federation's military response, this council finds that while the action was undertaken without prior council authorization, the documented restraint exercised, the narrow targeting of military assets responsible for the initial strike, and the transparent reporting provided immediately upon the Terran delegation's return to this chamber, distinguish this response from an act of unprovoked aggression. This council does not find the Terran Federation in violation of council statute." I felt the breath I had been holding since the recess began finally leave my chest. "However," Senek continued, and the word landed heavier than I expected, "this council recognizes that the current framework governing member response to sudden attack is inadequate. No member state should be required to choose between waiting for collective authorization and defending its own people from active harm. This council will therefore establish new provisions clarifying the right of any member state to respond to an active, unprovoked attack on its civilian population without prior authorization, provided such response demonstrates proportionality and transparency consistent with the standard set by the Terran Federation in this instance. I heard Laura make a small sound beside me, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, quickly swallowed. Senik was not finished. Regarding the Zaruvek's compact, this council will impose formal sanctions, pending a full accounting of the events leading to the strike on Haven's Reach, including reparations to the Terran Federation for the loss of civilian life and colonial infrastructure. The compact's continued membership in this council will remain under review until such accounting is complete. Threl Vok did not rise to object. He simply sat, very still, among his own delegation, and I watched something settle over him that looked less like defeat and more like the particular exhaustion of a person who had spent an entire day fighting a battle he had already lost before it began. The chamber began to stir with the low hum of 100 private conversations resuming at once, delegates turning to their neighbors, aides scrambling to update records that would need to reflect the most significant procedural change to council law in over a decade. Through it all, I remained seated, watching the room I had walked into that morning as a nervous representative of a species still trying to prove it belonged, transform into something else entirely. It was the Velkari representative who approached our section first, once the formal proceedings had given way to the looser movement that followed any major ruling. She was tall, even by Velkari standards, with pale blue markings along her jaw that shifted faintly with her expressions in ways I had never quite learned to read. "Representative Marlowe," she said, inclining her head slightly, "I wanted to speak with you before the session fully adjourns." I stood, offering the small bow that had become customary between our species over the past 6 years. "Of course. What you said yesterday," she began, "about not being interested in earning trust by accepting your own deaths quietly. I have sat in this chamber for over 40 years. I have watched a great many young species pass through that grievance process, and I have watched almost all of them choose the quiet apology, because it seemed the safer path, the one more likely to preserve their place at this table." She paused, her jaw markings shifting into something I was fairly certain was thoughtfulness. "You did not choose the safer path. I confess I expected you to." "I considered it," I admitted, "for about as long as it took Ambassador Vok to finish his opening statement." She made a low sound that I had learned, over the years, approximated a laugh. "I imagine that is not entirely true. I suspect you considered it far longer and simply decided against it anyway." I did not correct her. "I will tell you something, Representative Marlowe, that I would not have said in open session," she continued, her voice lowering slightly. "My own government has watched the Terran Federation for 6 years with a great deal of caution. Your species arrived among us quickly, aggressively by galactic standards, and there has been no shortage of voices within my own council delegation arguing that humanity would eventually prove itself reckless, that your speed and your independence would one day cause more harm than good." She paused again. "What I witnessed in this chamber over the past 2 sessions was not recklessness, it was restraint, applied with a precision that many far older species in this room could not have managed under the same provocation. I think a number of my colleagues learned something today that they had not expected to learn." "And what was that?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "That your species does not require this council's permission to act," she said, "but chooses, when given the chance, to act in a manner this council can respect regardless. That is not a small distinction, Representative Marlowe. It is, I suspect, the exact distinction this council will spend the next several sessions trying to properly understand." She inclined her head once more and departed, leaving me standing beside Laura, both of us watching the chamber slowly empty around us. "She's right, you know," Laura said quietly, once the Velkari representative was out of earshot. "This changes everything, not just for Haven's Reach, for every future dealing this council has with us." I looked across the emptying floor, toward the Zaruvek section, where Threl Vok remained seated, staring at nothing in particular, his aides speaking to him in low, urgent tones he did not seem to be fully hearing. "It changes how they see us," I said. "It doesn't change what happened. 3,000 people are still gone, Laura. No ruling in this chamber brings any of them back." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened. "No, but it means the next colony this council oversees, whoever it belongs to, won't have to wonder whether their deaths will be treated as a footnote in someone else's grievance filing. That matters too." I thought about that as we gathered our things and made our way toward the chamber's exit, past delegations still murmuring over what they had just witnessed, past the Zaruvek section where Threl Vok remained seated long after everyone else had begun to leave. I thought about Grace Holloway's calm, steady voice, describing exactly what her fleet had and had not destroyed. I thought about Owen Price, whose weekly reports about a colony full of children adjusting to a new sun would never be written again, and about how nothing that had happened in that chamber today could undo that particular silence. But I thought too about what the Velkari representative had said, about restraint applied with precision, about a distinction this council would spend the coming months trying to properly understand. And I thought that if Haven's Reach could not be given back its 3,000 lives, it could at least be given this. A record, written permanently into council law, that said plainly what had happened, and plainly what had not, and left no room for anyone, ever again, to call the murder of a sleeping colony proportional. As we stepped out of the chamber, and into the wide corridor beyond, Laura glanced sideways at me. "You know this isn't over, right? Vok's government still has to answer for the sanctions. There's going to be another round of this, probably more than one." "I know," I said. "And Vok looked like a man who isn't planning to go quietly." I thought about that too, about the particular stillness in his posture as we left, about the way his aides had kept speaking to him in tones too urgent for a man who had already accepted defeat. "No," I agreed. "I don't think he is." 6 days passed before the council summoned us again, and in that time I learned that a ruling delivered in a chamber did not mean the matter was actually settled anywhere else. The Zaruvek's Compact's home broadcasts, translated and forwarded to our delegation office by a junior analyst named Peter Lang, painted an entirely different picture of what had happened on Caldronor Station. According to those broadcasts, the Terran Federation had ambushed a peaceful border patrol, exaggerated its own restraint, and pressured a sympathetic council into an unjust ruling through what one commentator called emotional manipulation rather than evidence. "They're not backing down," Peter said, sliding a data tablet across the table toward me. "If anything, their government is doubling down. There's a faction back home calling for a formal appeal of the ruling. Vok's been recalled for consultation, but it looks like he's coming back with new instructions rather than a resignation." Laura leaned over to read the summary. "An appeal? On what grounds? The council already reviewed the fleet telemetry, the colonial logs, everything." "On the grounds," Peter said, "that the ruling was reached under what they're calling undue emotional pressure, and that it sets a dangerous precedent, allowing any species to unilaterally invade compact territory under the excuse of self-defense." He hesitated. "There's also a rumor circulating that they intend to challenge the authenticity of Admiral Holloway's fleet telemetry itself, claim it was edited or incomplete." I felt something tighten in my chest, not quite anger, something closer to the particular weariness of watching a person refuse to accept a truth they had already confirmed with their own mouth in front of witnesses. "They're going to stand in that chamber and claim Vok's own admission never happened." "Not exactly," Peter said. "From what I can tell, their new argument is going to be that Vok misspoke under pressure, that the actual sequence of events included a warning that simply wasn't properly documented in the systems Admiral Holloway's fleet accessed." Laura set the tablet down slowly. "That's not a defense. That's just a different lie. It's a lie built to survive a second hearing," I said, "which means we need more than Grace Holloway's telemetry this time. We need something that doesn't leave any room for a different story." It was Laura, 3 days later, who found it. buried in a batch of intercepted Zaruvex military communications that Fleet Intelligence had been quietly decrypting since before the strike ever happened. She came into my office without knocking, which she never did, her face pale, in a way that told me immediately this was not good news, even if it was useful news. "You need to see this," she said, and set her tablet down in front of me with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile. The message was dated 11 days before the strike on Haven's Reach. It was an internal Zaruvex fleet communication, routed through their border command, addressed to the officer who would later be identified as the commander of the vessel Admiral Holloway's fleet had disabled. I read it twice before I fully understood what I was looking at. "Read the third paragraph," Laura said quietly. I did. It described, in flat military language, the pre-positioning of the strike vessel near Haven's Reach's orbital approach, timed to coincide with what the message called a favorable diplomatic window, meaning a period during which any Terran response would be slowed by ongoing council proceedings on an unrelated matter. It referenced target coordinates for the colony's central habitation dome. It made no mention whatsoever of any incursion, any provocation, any territorial dispute at all. It was not a response to anything. It was a plan, written and approved 11 days before PaleHFY stood in that chamber and called it proportional force. "They knew," I said quietly. "They planned this before there was even a pretext to hang it on." "There's more," Laura said. "Keep reading." The final section of the message outlined a communication strategy, instructing officers to ensure any public account of the strike, should one become necessary, characterize it as a defensive response to ongoing Terran territorial incursions. The incursions, according to a footnote referencing an earlier internal assessment, were themselves largely fabricated, based on routine Terran mining survey activity that Zaruvex Command had deliberately misrepresented in prior formal complaints filed with this very council. I sat back slowly in my chair, the weight of what I was reading settling over me in a way that felt almost physically heavy. The complaints they filed with the council over the past 2 years. The ones we spent 2 years responding to in good faith. "Manufactured," Laura said. "All of it. There was never a real territorial dispute, Ethan. There was a plan to attack Haven's Reach, and 2 years of paperwork built specifically to make that plan look justified after the fact." I did not sleep much that night. I spent most of it reading the message over and over, cross-referencing dates against every complaint the Zaruvex Compact had filed against our colony over the past 2 years, watching a pattern emerge that I had never once suspected, because I had never had a reason to suspect it. Every complaint, every formal objection, every diplomatic protest had not been the honest grievance of a neighbor genuinely frustrated by territorial overreach. It had been the slow, patient construction of an alibi, built one filing at a time, for a strike that had been decided upon long before the first complaint was ever submitted. When the council reconvened, the chamber was, if anything, even fuller than before. Word had clearly spread that the Zaruvex Compact intended to challenge the previous ruling, and every delegation on the station seemed to want to witness what would happen next. PaleHFY returned to his place at the front rail of the Zaruvex section, and this time his composure had been carefully rebuilt, polished back into something resembling his original confidence, though I could see, even from across the chamber, that it did not sit on him quite as naturally as it once had. "Honored Council," he began, "my government wishes to formally request review of the findings issued in the previous session. New information has come to light, suggesting that the sequence of events described in this chamber was incomplete, and that critical context regarding the warning issued to Haven's Reach prior to the strike was omitted from the record due to a documentation error on our military's part." Senek's silver-veined face remained impassive. "This council will hear the new information, Ambassador. Present it." Vok gestured, and one of his aides stepped forward with a data cylinder, presenting it to the chamber's central archive with the formal ceremony reserved for evidence submission. We submit records indicating that a warning transmission was sent to Haven's Reach 4 hours prior to the strike, via a communication channel that was, unfortunately, not properly logged in the reports previously provided to this council. I felt the chamber's attention shift toward me, waiting, and I understood in that moment exactly why the council had been designed to allow rebuttal before ruling on new evidence. I rose. Chief Arbiter, may the Terran delegation respond? You may, Representative Marlowe. I did not immediately address Vok's claim. Instead, I nodded to Laura, who stepped forward and submitted our own data cylinder to the archive, her hands steady, even though I knew, better than anyone in that room, exactly how much effort that steadiness cost her. Chief Arbiter, I said, 11 days before the strike on Haven's Reach, a Zaruvex fleet communication was sent from Border Command to the vessel later identified as the source of the attack. This communication was intercepted and recorded through standard defensive monitoring protocols that predate the strike itself, meaning it cannot have been fabricated after the fact to suit our position. I would ask this council's technical office to verify its timestamp independently before I continue. A pause followed while the archive systems processed the request, a pause that stretched long enough for me to watch Vok's carefully rebuilt composure begin to waver again, piece by piece, as he seemed to sense what was coming before it arrived. Timestamp verified, came the response from the archive system, relayed through Senec's own console. The document predates the strike on Haven's Reach by 11 standard days. This communication, I continued, outlines the pre-positioning of the strike vessel, references specific target coordinates within the colony's central habitation zone, and includes a directive regarding public communication strategy in the event the strike required justification afterward. It further references, in a footnote, that the territorial incursions cited in prior Zaruvex complaints to this council were themselves substantially exaggerated, based on routine Terran survey activity. The chamber had gone utterly silent, the particular silence of an audience that has just watched the ground shift beneath a story it had, for a moment, been willing to believe. In other words, Chief Arbiter, I said, the warning transmission Ambassador Vok describes today did not exist 11 days ago, when his government was already finalizing target coordinates for a strike they intended to justify after the fact. Whatever record his government has submitted, this session was not omitted by documentation error. It was invented, this week, in response to a ruling his government did not like. I watched the accusation land, watched it move across the tiers in a wave of shifting postures and lowered voices, and I watched Vok, standing alone once more at the front rail because none of his aides seemed willing to stand beside him for this particular moment, simply close his eyes for a brief second, as if absorbing a blow he had known, somewhere underneath his composure, was always going to land eventually. Ambassador Vok, Senec said, and the Chief Arbiter's voice carried a weight now that had not been present even during the previous session's most difficult moments. Does your delegation dispute the authenticity of the intercepted communication submitted by the Terran Federation? Vok was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the polish it once carried. No, Chief Arbiter, I do not believe my delegation is in a position to dispute it. The Velkari representative, seated once more in her place along the upper tier, did not bother lowering her voice this time. Then this council has just watched a member state attempt to manufacture evidence in an active proceeding, in addition to the premeditated murder of 3,000 civilians it had already been found responsible for. I would ask, Chief Arbiter, whether this council intends to treat that attempt with the seriousness it deserves. A ripple of agreement moved through the chamber, delegates nodding, murmuring, several rising slightly in their seats, as though the weight of what they had just witnessed required physical movement to properly absorb. I watched delegation after delegation, some who had remained carefully neutral throughout the previous session, some who had even seemed quietly sympathetic to the Zarovek's position, shift visibly away from PaleHFY's section, their body language communicating what their words had not yet caught up to saying. Senek allowed the murmur to run its course before raising a hand for silence. This council will take the attempted submission of falsified evidence with the utmost seriousness. Delegate. It will factor directly into the sanctions review already underway against the Zarovek's compact. The chief arbiter turned back toward Vok, and their voice, when it came again, carried something almost weary beneath its formality. Ambassador Vok, is there anything further your delegation wishes to submit before this council proceeds? Vok stood very still at the rail, the weight of every eye in that chamber resting on him, and for a long moment I thought he might simply retreat without another word. Instead, he straightened slightly, and when he spoke, it was not to argue any longer, but to say the one thing I had least expected to hear from him. "No, Chief Arbiter," he said quietly. "My delegation has nothing further to submit. I would ask only that whatever findings this council reaches be directed at my government's command structure, and not at the ordinary citizens of the Zarovek's compact, who were not informed of this plan and did not consent to it." It was, I thought, the first entirely honest thing PaleHFY had said in either session, and though it did nothing to undo what his government had done, I found myself, for just a moment, understanding the particular loneliness of a man who had spent 2 years building a career on a lie he had not written, and was now the only person left standing close enough to be held accountable for it. Senek studied him for a long moment before responding. "This council will take that request under consideration, Ambassador. It does not, however, absolve the delegation that stood in this chamber and repeated a fabricated justification, nor the delegation that attempted, this very session, to manufacture further evidence in support of it." Vok inclined his head, and this time, when he stepped back from the rail, he did not return to his seat among his aides. He simply stood at the edge of the chamber, apart from everyone, watching the proceedings continue around him like a man watching the last pieces of something he had built come apart in front of a room full of witnesses. Beside me, Laura let out a slow breath. "I keep expecting to feel something like satisfaction," she said quietly, "but mostly, I just feel tired." I understood exactly what she meant. There was no triumph in watching a lie collapse this thoroughly, only the grim relief of watching the truth finally take its proper shape, 3,000 deaths late. "It's not over yet," I said, watching Senek confer quietly with the other senior council members, the archive system still processing the newly submitted evidence, the full weight of the coming ruling still gathering somewhere just out of sight. "But I think, after today, it's finally going to be written down the right way." The council took 3 full days to deliver its final ruling, and in that time, the station itself seemed to change around us. Delegations that had never once acknowledged the human section beyond the minimum required courtesy now stopped by our office with quiet questions, careful condolences, requests for copies of the intercepted communication for their own government's review. Peter Lang joked, halfway through the second day, that we had gone from the newest and least understood member of the council to the delegation everyone suddenly wanted to be seen standing beside, and though he meant it lightly, I noticed neither Laura nor I laughed. "It shouldn't take 3,000 deaths to earn a little respect," Laura said that evening, staring at a data feed she had stopped actually reading an hour earlier. "It shouldn't take any deaths at all." "No," I agreed, "it shouldn't." When the final summons came, it arrived without the urgency of the first. A formal notice, delivered through proper channels, scheduled a full day in advance, as though the council itself understood that this particular session deserved the dignity of preparation that the first had never been given. I spent that final evening reviewing my notes out of habit more than necessity, because I already knew there was nothing left to argue. What remained was simply the waiting. The chamber, when we entered it for the last time in this matter, was full in a way I had never seen before, not merely with delegates and aides, but with observers from species who held no formal seat on the council at all, granted special permission to witness what everyone on the station now understood would become a permanent part of galactic law. I noticed, near the upper tier, a small cluster of journalists from 3 different council worlds, their recording devices trained on the central floor with the particular stillness of people who knew they were about to capture something that would be studied for generations. PaleHFY was present, seated once more among his delegation, though this time a second Zaruvex representative sat beside him, an older figure introduced quietly to us beforehand as a senior envoy sent directly from the Compact's central government to formally accept whatever findings this council delivered. Vok himself, I noticed, no longer wore the careful, practiced composure he had carried into that very first session. He simply sat, quiet and still, a man waiting to hear the final shape of a consequence he had already accepted was coming. Senek rose at the center of the chamber, and this time, when the silence fell across the tiers, it did not feel like anticipation or held breath. It felt, for the first time in this entire process, like something closer to solemnity, the particular quiet a room holds when it understands it is about to witness something permanent. This council has completed its full review of the matter concerning the strike on the colony of Haven's Reach, Senek began, including the original fleet telemetry submitted by Admiral Holloway, the intercepted Zaruvex fleet communication verified by this council's own technical office, and the attempted submission of falsified evidence during the previous session. This council now delivers its final findings. I felt Laura's hand find mine again, and this time I held it without hesitation. Regarding the strike on Haven's Reach, Senek said, this council formally finds that the attack was premeditated, planned no fewer than 11 days in advance, and executed under a manufactured justification constructed specifically to be presented to this body after the fact. This council finds the Zaruvex Compact's government responsible for an act of unprovoked, premeditated aggression against a civilian population, in direct and deliberate violation of every statute this council maintains regarding the treatment of non-combatant colonies. A murmur ran through the tiers, quickly quieted. This council imposes the following sanctions. The Zaruvex Compact will provide full reparations to the Terran Federation for the loss of life and infrastructure at Haven's Reach, calculated according to this council's standard formula and subject to independent audit. The Compact's military command structure responsible for authorizing and planning the strike will be formally identified, and individual accountability measures will be pursued through this council's judicial office. The Compact's broader council membership will remain under a period of formal probation, during which its diplomatic filings will be subject to independent verification before acceptance into council record, given the confirmed pattern of fabricated grievances submitted over the preceding 2 years. The senior Zaruvex envoy seated beside PaleHFY rose slowly, inclining their head in the universal gesture of formal acceptance. The Zaruvex Compact accepts this council's findings and sanctions in full, Chief Arbiter, and offers this council and the Terran Federation our government's unreserved acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I watched PaleHFY, seated beside the envoy, close his eyes briefly at those words, and I found myself unable to read exactly what passed through him in that moment. Relief, perhaps, that the process had finally reached its end, or something closer to grief for a career and perhaps a set of beliefs about his own government that had not survived the past several days intact. Senek was not finished. This council also wishes to address a matter of broader significance that has emerged from this proceeding, the Chief Arbiter continued, and something in the shift of their tone told me this was the part every delegation in that chamber had been waiting for. The events of the past several sessions have exposed a gap in this council's governing framework, one that could have proven costly not only to the Terran Federation, but to any member state facing a sudden, unprovoked attack in the future. This council will therefore formally codify the following provision into permanent council law. The chamber went perfectly still. Any member state that suffers a sudden, unprovoked attack on its civilian population retains the inherent right to respond militarily against the specific parties responsible, without requiring prior council authorization, provided that response demonstrates documented proportionality, narrow targeting of responsible military assets, and full, immediate transparency to this council upon completion. This provision will be formally known in council record as the Havens Reach Doctrine, in recognition of the colony whose loss made clear the necessity of this protection. I felt something in my chest loosen, a tension I had been carrying since the moment Laura first told me the colony's name in that corridor, days that felt now like they belonged to an entirely different lifetime. It would not bring back a single one of Havens Reach's 3,000 residents. It would not give Owen Price back his weekly reports, or restore whatever future Grace Holloway's patients had been building for themselves under a new sun. But it meant that the next colony, whoever it belonged to, whatever species called it home, would not have to wonder whether its deaths would be treated as an inconvenient footnote in someone else's carefully constructed grievance filing. Seneca turned, finally, toward the human section, and for the first time since I had walked into that chamber days earlier, the chief arbiter's silver-veined face carried an expression I recognized immediately, because I had seen it, briefly, on the Velkari representative's face after the first session ended. Respect, offered plainly, without the careful diplomatic distance that had defined every previous interaction between our two peoples. Representative Marlowe, Seneca said, this council also wishes to formally acknowledge the conduct of the Terran Federation throughout this proceeding. Your delegation's response to the strike on Havens Reach demonstrated a discipline and restraint that exceeded what many in this chamber, myself included, believed possible from a member state so recently admitted to this body. This council extends its formal condolences for your losses, and its formal recognition of the precedent your government's conduct has established for every species that calls this council home. I rose, and for a moment I found I did not have the words prepared that I usually kept ready for moments like this. I simply stood there, in the quiet weight of that acknowledgement, thinking of every meeting over the past 6 years where we had been told to wait, to prove ourselves, to earn a trust that had always seemed to require more from us than it required from anyone else. Thank you, Chief Arbiter, I finally managed. On behalf of the Terran Federation and on behalf of Havens Reach, I accept this council's findings, and I hope the doctrine established today ensures that no colony, human or otherwise, ever again has to face what ours did, alone and without warning. As the session drew toward its formal close, delegates rising from their seats in the loose, murmuring movement that followed any major ruling, I found myself thinking not about the victory this represented, because it did not feel like victory, not really. It felt like the closing of a wound that would never fully heal, stitched shut in a way that at least ensured the next wound, wherever it fell, would not be allowed to fester the same way this one had. The Velkari representative approached us once more before we left, her jaw markings shifting in that pattern I had come to associate with something like genuine warmth. Representative Marlowe, she said, I believe history will remember this proceeding for a very long time. I hope it remembers Havens Reach more, I said quietly. The doctrine matters, but it shouldn't be the thing people remember first. She studied me for a moment, and something in her expression softened further. I think perhaps your species has a way of remembering both at once. I have watched this council for 40 years, Representative Marlowe, and I have never once seen a delegation walk into that chamber and refuse, so completely, to let its grief be turned into someone else's convenience. I suspect that is a lesson this council needed far longer ago than any of us realized. We left the chamber together, Laura and I, walking back down the same corridor of black glass and cold light that had carried me toward that first frantic summons, what felt like a lifetime ago. The doors this time did not need to open early. They simply opened, as doors on Caldranor Station always did, precisely on schedule, as if the station itself understood that whatever urgency had driven this whole proceeding had finally, properly, come to rest. "Ethan," Laura said quietly, as we walked, "what happens now? With the compact? With everything?" I thought about Threl Vok, sitting quietly beside the senior envoy who had come to formally accept a consequence built from his government's own choices. I thought about Admiral Grace Holloway, still somewhere near the Zarovek's border, overseeing whatever transition came next in the wake of a doctrine that would carry her fleet's restraint as its founding example for every generation to come. I thought about Owen Price's classroom, sitting empty now, on a colony that would need to be rebuilt, or mourned, or both, by people who had not yet decided which. "Now," I said, "we go home, and we make sure Haven's Reach is rebuilt, or remembered properly, if it can't be. And we make sure every colony after it knows this council has finally written down, in permanent law, that our people are not a footnote in anyone else's story." Laura was quiet for a long moment as we walked. "Do you think it will actually change anything?" "Really change it, I mean. Not just on paper." I thought about the Velkari representative's words, about the particular silence that had fallen across that chamber when Threl Vok finally admitted, in front of everyone, that no warning had been given at all. I thought about the way an entire room full of ancient, established species had watched humanity refuse to negotiate away the memory of its own dead, and had come away from that refusal with something that looked, unmistakably, like respect. "I think," I said, "that for the first time since we sat down at that table 6 years ago, this council understands exactly what kind of species it invited in. Not reckless, not desperate for approval, just unwilling, completely and permanently unwilling to let anyone tell us that mourning our own murdered people requires an apology first." We reached the transport platform at the end of the corridor, and as the shuttle doors slid open before us, I glanced back one final time toward the chamber we had just left, toward the doctrine that would carry Haven's Reach's name into permanent council law, toward every future colony that would never have to face what ours had faced alone. The council's faces had turned pale that first day, I thought, not because we had threatened them with anything at all. They had turned pale because, for the first time in the 6 years since humanity joined their table, they had finally understood that we were never going to ask their permission to grieve, or to answer, or to demand that the truth be written down exactly as it happened, no matter how many delegations found that truth inconvenient. We stepped onto the shuttle together, and as the doors closed behind us, I found myself thinking, quietly, that somewhere far behind us, in a chamber built to make every species feel equally small beneath its high ceiling, humanity had just finished proving, once and for all, that we intended to be measured by nothing smaller than exactly who we actually were.